Thank you very much, everybody. And just to say, I'm delighted to be back. I know I was only here a few weeks ago, and I really appreciate that you've asked me back again. It's really good to see familiar faces and to be welcomed so warmly. So thank you. I've been asked to speak about professionalising teaching in higher education, and I'm going to be moving between a big global perspective to a local perspective to make the particular argument I want to make about professionalising teaching. And to do that, I'm going to begin by asking, why should we develop academic teachers? And you'll notice I've used the term academic teachers, because I think teachers in higher education are actually called upon to do something different to teachers in other parts of the system. But maybe that'll become clear as I go through the presentation. If you look at the history of higher education, you can see quite clearly that in the late 20th century, the role of universities across the globe shifted. And you can see that shift starting to emerge from, say, the 1960s onwards. And what happened was, traditionally, universities were focused on the abstract pursuit of knowledge. That's why they were set up. They were set up literally just to find this knowledge which could benefit humankind. The idea that universities should provide workers, should develop professionals, that came later. The initial function of the university was around this knowledge as a public good. There is knowledge out there that can benefit humankind. Therefore, we have to find that knowledge in order to provide the benefits. And the places that will find that knowledge and disseminate it are the universities. And of course, that had all sorts of effects, because if you look at the idea that knowledge exists out there and it can be discovered to benefit humanity, then the role of the state, for example, in funding universities becomes really important. You just fund a university to produce this knowledge. So that was the traditional idea around universities, even though they'd always trained some professionals, particularly around the law, the religious professions and so on, with the more modern professions coming later. The focus was very much on knowledge production. So over time, we've had this huge privileging of research in the universities. That's what they understand their purpose to be about. And academics also understood their role to be in the production of this knowledge, not as teachers. Over that period, the traditional period I'm talking about, the universities admitted a very small elite. And if you look at, for example, Great Britain, United Kingdom, only 2% of the 18 to 24-year-old cohort went to university in the 1970s. So I've given Britain as an example. That would be matched by other systems. Very small higher education systems admitting a very elite group of students. Those students came from very particular kinds of backgrounds. And they then came through the universities, and they then went out into the professions, or they became academics themselves. However, things have changed. If you look at analyses of what's broadly called globalization, which South Africa had to confront quite lately, as it were, because of our own particular history with apartheid, you see that the impact of globalization, and particularly what analysts call the development of a new work order, then produced a new role for the universities. Now, forgive me if I just go into a bit of background here, but I want to try to explain in more detail what that's about. If you look at the sort of growth of factories in the 20th century, if you look, for example, at Henry Ford and the motor car, okay, he's often quoted as saying, you can have any color you want as long as it's black. His idea was that you could produce motor cars on an assembly line, And you could produce large numbers of those cars, which were all the same. And you could produce them very efficiently by having them moving along this assembly line. Now, the people who were required to work in that form of economic production actually had very, very low skills. You might be working in a Ford motor car factory, and you might do exactly the same job every day of your working life for your entire working life. And that job might simply be putting a particular component in place, literally lifting and putting into place. Globalization changed that. And the argument is that what happened with globalization is that rather at looking at the mass production of goods, where all the goods are the same, by low-skilled workers, what it did was it looked at the reinvention of existing goods. So nowadays, we're used to having a huge choice. We don't want a black motor car, and we don't want a black Ford. We want any number of colours along any range of manufacturers. But it becomes, more complex than that. I'm going to give you an example, and one of the examples where you see the new work order most closely is in shops like Mr. Price Home. You can go to Mr. Price Home one week and you can see a bottle opener. Now, a bottle opener is a fairly simple tool. It's got a metal triangular bit on the end, and you use it to lift the top of a bottle, whether it's Coke or beer or whatever. The metal end is that fundamental tool. But you can go one week to Mr. Price Home and you can see a card with very attractive bottle openers on, and maybe the top of each bottle opener has the plastic head of some sort of worker. So you might be able to buy a policeman or a firefighter or a nurse or whatever. And you look at them and you think, oh, that's cute. I'll have one of those. It's only 14 rands. You've got a bottle opener in your drawer at home, but you buy it. You might go back a few weeks later and, whoa, there's another card of bottle openers. But this time, they don't have the heads of the people on them. They've got plastic fruits. So you can buy an apple, you can buy a pear, you can buy an orange, you can buy a pineapple. And you look at it again and you think, oh, that's cute. I'll have one of those. And even though you've already got 2 bottle openers in your drawer at home, you buy another one. So what the new work order is considered to be related to is the creation of demand through the reinvention of existing goods. And you can move it up a scale and you think about a cell phone. I got a new cell phone a few weeks ago. I didn't need a new cell phone. The old one worked worked well. But I was due for an upgrade, so why shouldn't I get the upgrade when MTN are offering it to me? So I've got a cell phone that works sitting in the drawer at home, and I've got a new cell phone. The demand was created for me, not only by the development of newer models, but also about the marketing system where you buy a contract that gives you a new phone every 2 years. So our economy is based on creating demand, and on creating demand through the reinvention of existing goods. And arguably that then requires a new kind of worker, not someone who does the same job over and over again for the rest of their lives, but rather so-called knowledge workers, people who at various levels can work with this reinvention process. They might be designers, they might be people actually developing the new goods. There might be people in factories at the very lowest end of this work order, but because the goods change regularly, they have to get used to doing different things on the assembly line. So they will not always do the same thing. The assembly line will be reconfigured to produce the new goods in some way. And of course, it's global. So something might be produced, designed in, for example, Silicon Valley in California, but it might actually be produced in China. And so the design comes out of California, but the factory that makes it is set up in China, and then the goods from China have to be distributed around the world. And that then sets up other kinds of jobs around how do you get them from China to wherever. I was amazed a few years ago when I gave my son, my younger son, a gift of an iPad, and he was in England at the time, and I was able to track his iPad as it tried to get to him in time for Christmas, from the factory in China through Rotterdam Freeport, and I could see it sitting in Rotterdam Freeport for about 6 hours, and then it finally went on to the UK. Now that's a pretty sophisticated system, and somebody needed to set that up. So basically the shift in economic production has called for knowledge workers, highly skilled people who can work in all sorts of different ways to design and get these goods to us eventually. Now that's produced a new role for the universities. Rather than producing knowledge, we're now being called upon to produce these knowledge workers. And the response from nation states across the world has been increased participation in higher education. They've grown the higher education systems. So if you look at the United Kingdom, and I was saying that in the 1970s they had 2% participation, they've now got 50%. So that means that 50% of all 18-year-olds go into a university. Huge, huge, huge increase. Significantly, as those higher education systems have massified, they've grown, they've also diversified, and they've diversified in a number of ways. Universities tended to be what we would call in South Africa the traditional universities. Traditional universities organized around the academic disciplines, focused on the production of knowledge for their own sake. Now you get different kinds of universities, and we all know in South Africa we've got the so-called traditional universities, we've got the universities of technology, and we've got the comprehensive universities. Other higher education systems sort their higher education systems out in different ways, but they're all differentiated systems. It's not only the system that's differentiated, though, it's the students who've differentiated. Let me just go back there. I said that traditionally a small elite, an elite got into universities. Now, open the doors, let more people in. What now happens is that you get a wide range of people from very different social, cultural, linguistic, economic backgrounds in our universities. And what that means for a university teacher, doesn't matter whether you're a UOT or traditional or whatever, what that means is that you're likely to have different people in the class to the people who sat beside you when you were a student. And that applies for all the universities. I think most of us in this room are still of an age where we came from a relatively elite system. And so the students who sat beside us were part of that elite. But now it's changed. So the students sitting in front of you are going to be different to you. And that's not only true of South Africa, that's true of everywhere across the world, whether it's the United Kingdom, Australia, China, or the United States. Now, if we look at what this has all meant for South Africa, if you go back and your Deputy Vice-Chancellor has just been talking about the election, if you go back to our first election, the early 1990s, South Africa had to cope with two enormous challenges simultaneously. We had to cope with the shift to democracy, to equity, but we also had to confront globalization at the same time because we'd been separated. We'd been excluded because of the boycotts and so on. So the 1990s come along, and internally we have to deal with the need for equity, the historical need for equity. But at the same time, we have to compete in the global economy and move outside there to make literally to earn the money to be able to fund the changes internally. So we had a double challenge. And if you look at the higher education policy since then, it's tried to address the need for equity on one hand and efficiency on the other hand. Those two things often, they're not easy to address simultaneously. It's a bit like a seesaw in a park. If you push the need for equity, often efficiency goes down. So then you try to bring efficiency up and equity goes down. And the way you see that most visibly in our higher education system is around access. Open the doors, let more students, let a greater variety of students in for the sake of equity, and your efficiency goes down. So your success, your throughput, your graduation rates go down. If you then tighten access, you could expect those figures to go up. But we can't do that. We've got to deal with equity and efficiency at the same time. And in all the policy documents, you see that struggle. You see slight shifts as they move between one and the other. But basically, it's South Africa trying to confront those two things simultaneously. And more recently, if you go back into, say, the 1990s and the early parts of 2000, the first decade, we were very focused on equity. But now concerns have come around efficiency. And the talk everywhere is of success, graduation and throughput rates. If you look at, for example, the new National Development Plan, which was published earlier this year, you can see there the concern is around efficiency of our higher education system. So what's been done to address efficiency? Because this impacts on academic teachers. Well, the first thing we had, of course, was the SAQA Act of 1995 and the introduction of the National Qualifications Framework, the ladder of qualifications, which made it possible literally for learners to bank bits of learning and to move across and up a framework to become more and more skilled as they did that. Why did we get it? Well, we got it because of globalization. We got it because we needed these highly skilled knowledge workers, and we had a workforce which had been denied skills, which had been denied access to higher education. And critically, we got outcomes-based education. We got the construct of the learning outcome as the organizing principle for that framework. You can't make the framework work without learning outcomes, because learning outcomes describe the learning. And to make the framework work, you've got to have one principle across the whole thing. You can't have one university describing learning in one way and another university describing it in another way. So we describe the learning using this notion of the learning outcome. And as you all know, learning outcomes require us to think about what students can do. It's very much practice, skills-based, not what's in their heads. So that's been an enormous shift for academic teachers. We've also had the incentive-based funding formula, and you know all about that. You know how the more graduates you can produce, the better the money you'll get as subsidy, and you also know about how the funding formula works for teaching and for research, where research brings in large amounts of funding, where the amount of money which is paid for a research unit, a publication, or a master's graduate is 1 unit, a PhD graduate is 3 units. That's enormously lucrative for the universities. So all the universities, because of the funding, you can start to see them chasing research. We've also had quality assurance, which was introduced from 2000 onwards. And it's interesting, if you look at the quality assurance frameworks, they asked, what is the university doing to assure quality? What are the mechanisms? It's almost like looking at the mechanisms on an assembly line. you know, if you have a factory producing cell phones, there'll have to be quality checks, but there's also got to be procedures in place to ensure that the next bit of the production is up to standard. Well, that's basically what they were asking us to do, to put those mechanisms in place. So it was an efficiency kind of idea in the quality assurance system. So what we have now, I would argue, is a lot of talk in this country, dominant discourses, dominant talk, particularly around teaching and learning, focus on efficiency. There's a so-called crisis in teaching and learning in higher education. The CHE last year produced that proposal for the introduction of a flexible curriculum. And that document is very much centered on this idea of a crisis. And it's about how we could increase the number of graduates without putting extra money into the system by introducing a flexible curriculum. So it's about getting more of these skilled knowledge workers out of the universities. We've also had, in order to address efficiency, so-called earmarked funding. We've got teaching development grants, we've got research development grants. And over time, those grants have become more and more focused on ensuring that universities use that money to develop teaching or research in the name of efficiency. I'm going to come back to the teaching development grants later. But remember, we have to address equity at the same time. Arguably, one of the easiest ways we could increase our success throughput and graduation rates would be to close off access to the lower performing students. And we make our system smaller, and we then get the throughput, the more efficient throughput that we need. But we can't afford to do that because of our own particular history. So we've got to address both together. The first piece of policy we had there was, of course, the White Paper of 1997, which interestingly was called a Programme for Transformation. So this idea of transformation has often focused on the need for equity. We've also had earmarked foundation programme grants. They were actually introduced from 2000 onwards. That was when they first came online, although most universities only applied for them in 2004. So as you all know, what they allow a university to do is develop a programme where students do the qualification over 4 rather than 3 years. But interestingly, we've had no redress funding. Redress funding for historically black, historically disadvantaged universities did not come. And I think there's a strong argument. I wrote a paper with Vivian Buzzelek of UWC in 2012, where we argued that that's been an omission in our system. So the only funding towards redress we've actually had have been arguably these foundation programme grants. We've also had, as I indicated earlier, a focus on transformation in the first rounds of institutional audits. We were all required not only to look at this efficiency, what procedures have you got in place to produce quality students, but particularly at universities like mine, historically white, very privileged, we really were hammered on transformation. We were hammered on our figures, not only for students, but also for staff. So those first rounds of institutional audits were asking all universities to take up the challenge because some had basically managed to avoid it. Anyway, if you look now at some of that policy, I've by no means looked at it all. What have been the effects on our system? Well, we've had enormous growth. If you look at student numbers in 1994, 490,000, just short of 500,000. And the last figures we have available, 2009, it takes some time for the HEMAS stuff and whatever to be collated, but these come from the National Development Plan. It's 837 just we're still below 1 million in our higher education system. So we've had a 71% increase in student participation, the number of students in higher education. We've also had diversification as well as massification, but I'm going to problematize that in a minute. Historically, universities like MUT have always dealt with poor, black, working class students from poor educational backgrounds. Universities like mine, we've also now had to diversify in the ways that are more representative of our country. We're still not doing it as well as we should, but we still have diversified. However, South Africa is still an elite system. And when you're on the ground teaching, it might be quite hard to appreciate that when you see the students in front of you. We're still a very elite system. We've only got 17% of 18-year-olds coming into higher education. Compare that to Britain, which I mentioned earlier, which has got 50%. And some countries like the United States and Australia, they've got more. China is really trying to push participation. They're struggling because they've got such a large population, which is why you start to see Chinese students appearing in other higher education systems across the world. But whatever you might think when you look at your class, you're still teaching a very elite group of students. However, participation is skewed. Only 12% of black and coloured 18-year-olds come into higher education. The figures for Indian students are 47% and 51% white. So you can see how the historical legacy continues to affect our system. The funding formula promotes research. I've already alluded to the amount of money available for research outputs. And yes, we get money for teaching and learning, but the research funding is hugely lucrative. And universities now mostly have research offices, research development offices, where academics are being hammered for research outputs. Literally, we're all under the cosh to produce research. And then you have to look at the teaching research end of the seesaw. Can you do both? It's very difficult to do both. At the same time as we're being hammered to produce research, the funding per head, per student, in real terms has decreased. So what academic teachers are being required to do is more with less. The subsidy, if you look at inflation in RAND terms and so on, universities are getting less per student than they were getting in 1994. But the system has grown. Earlier this year, the new National Development Plan was published, and you can start to see how that pans out into the future, what we're going to be expected to do for 2030. And some of us might be glad that we won't be around for that much longer, working anyway. They want us to increase participation in higher education to 1.6 million in 2030. Now, we've got 2 new universities coming online, one in Mpumalanga and one in the Northern Cape. But that's a lot of students because we're under 1 million now, and we're being asked to take it up to another 0.6 of a million in the next, 16 years? It's a lot. So you can expect existing universities to have to grow. The National Development Plan argues that we have to increase the throughput rate. And they use the same argument that was used in the CHE document around the flexible curriculum. And it's about economic productivity. It's about value for money. So what we do is we're taking students into the system. They're taking a long time to go through and get a qualification, and then we don't have the skilled workers at the other end. So there's a strong argument around the economy for the need to increase the throughput rate. The National Plan calls on us to increase postgraduate enrolments to 25%. Now, some of the so-called research-intensive universities now have postgraduate enrolments at about 25%, but those universities are trying to push it up to about 30%. But if overall in the system we're being asked to have 25% enrolments, that means that all universities are being asked to move for much greater postgraduate enrolments. Then you have to ask questions around, well, what does that mean for undergraduate teaching? Because you're being asked to teach at postgraduate level as well. But of course, one argument there is that in order to get postgraduates, you've got to teach undergraduates particularly well. Your undergraduates are your future postgraduates. We're being asked to increase the number of PhDs to 100 per million of the population. At the moment, we only have 28 per million of the population in South Africa. So what that washes out to is that South Africa needs 5,000 doctoral graduates a year, and we only produce 1,420 in 2010. So there's all sorts of moves afoot to ask, how can universities increase the number of PhDs? And again, what do? Do you look at postgraduate programs, and particularly PhD programs? And what does that do for your undergraduate teaching? But you can't neglect undergraduate teaching because your future PhDs are your current undergraduates. So you can start to see how the pressure is being piled on for teaching. But also significantly, we're being asked to produce the next generation of academics. There's a gap in the academic workforce. Academic life might have been a particularly attractive way to spend one's career. At one point, it's no longer being perceived as so attractive. And that's not only in South Africa, that's globally. The demands on academics are considered to have increased exponentially. Academics are being pulled in all sorts of ways. Salaries don't always match what can be earned in business and industry. And so it's not so attractive. In South Africa, the vast bulk of researchers are going to retire quite soon. And we've got a big gap. While we might have a smaller number of academics, and particularly black academics, coming in at the lower levels of the academic hierarchy, while they have to mature to get into experienced researcher levels, we're going to have this gap. So if you look at all the policy documents now, they're really asking us to think very hard about, first of all, how you can fill the gap, and then how you can accelerate the next generation. And if any of you are thinking of retirement in the near future, maybe you've got to rethink that, because you might well be asked to stay on. So all these lead to challenges for academics on the ground, for people in classrooms, in universities, not only in South Africa, this is across the world, because you can see what happens in South Africa in other higher education systems. If you read the journals on higher education, you read the books, the same observations are made everywhere, the same complaints are made everywhere. Academics are going to have to get a PhD. If we're going to have to produce PhDs, and particularly we need PhDs in the new areas, the areas where the universities of technology are focused. Well, if you're starting off on your academic life, I think you've got to think really hard about when and how you're going to get that PhD. You need to produce research, because the research office is probably going to be on your back. And to get promotion, you're going to need to produce research. But at the same time, you're going to have to teach large classes with decreasing resources. And you're going to have to teach so-called underprepared students. So that seems like a pretty hard task for any academic. Let's look briefly at that last point. Let's look briefly at the nature of underpreparedness, because what I want to do now is to start moving into looking at the development of academic teachers, what that means for them in particular. All these pressures, but you've got large classes, minimal resources, and you've got these underprepared teachers, underprepared students. The single greatest indicator of access to in success in higher education at a global level is socioeconomic status. It doesn't matter where you look. If your parents come from certain socioeconomic classes, and more particularly, if your parents are educated, your caregivers are educated, you are likely to access and succeed in higher education more than any other group. You can actually take schooling out of that, because that applies regardless of the nature of schooling, even in countries where they have relatively well-functioning schooling systems, like Britain and the United States. Socioeconomic class, or the educational level of the parent, still remains as the greatest indicator of us accessing and succeeding in higher education. Well, why is that? What is it about education of the parent? Well, we've got lots of research. I've only quoted a bit of it here. Educated parents prepare their children for school. If you sit a child on your lap with a picture book and you start talking to the child about the pictures in the book, typically what we do is we look at the picture and we say to the child, "Oh, look, here's a doggy. And what's the doggy doing? The doggy's running after the ball. What's the doggy's name? The doggy's name is Spot." And then you turn to the child and you say, "What's the doggy's name?" And the child says, "Spot." And you say, "Clever boy, well done." That's typical behavior of an educated caregiver. And what you do there is you prepare the child to answer a question to which the person asking the question already knows the answer. And that is typical of schooling. What does the teacher do? The teacher asks questions to which she knows the answer. But all the studies that I've quoted a few of them there, they track children going into school who sit there, and when the teacher asks a question, the children don't answer because they don't know why they should answer that question, because the answer's apparent. They haven't been groomed into this schooled behavior. Educated parents support their children in school. How many of you, when your children come home at the end of the day, ask, "What have you got for homework tonight?" How many of you check that the children are doing the homework? How many of you sit about reading at home, not watching the television, but reading at home? Because if you sit about reading at home, you're showing your children that reading is an okay activity. It's something which grown-ups do, and therefore they will want to emulate you. I wonder how many of you have watched your children with a book, even long before they could read, paging through the book and saying, "Look, I'm reading." But in fact, they can't read, but they just know that reading is an okay thing to do. Educated parents go beyond school. They do things with their children which extend school learning, not only support the learning of the school, but actually pull it further, extend it. One of the things my brother and I often laugh about when we remember very fondly our father, who sadly has been dead for quite a long time now, is we remember him arguing with the newspaper. He took a daily newspaper, and it seemed to us that the only point of getting the newspaper was not to read it and get information, but rather argue with the stupidity of what was being said in the newspaper. Now, what our own father was modeling there for us was so-called critical reading. The criticality, that it's not just that you accept everything that's said, but rather you'll always bring this reasoned mind to it and question it. So you can track those sorts of behaviors in all sorts of ways in homes of educated parents. And we've actually got quite a lot of work on that in South Africa as well. And it comes through in all sorts of strange ways. There are also questions about the extent to which schooling prepares the dispositions for higher education. I'm sure many of you have told your students, in a university you're not going to be spoon-fed. Yeah, well, we associate spoon feeding often with the schooling system, and then they come into the universities and we're looking for so-called independent, critical, creative learners. But the schools often are working in very different ways to that. Even the best schools, and we at Rhodes, we have students who come from some of the best schools in South Africa, and they come with 45, 48 points, and they fail in first year. And you can start tracking their failure from the middle of the first year onwards. But in addition, and I'm still going on about underpreparedness, what does it mean? I've sort of problematized the assumption that schools do prepare for higher education completely. I'm saying that the home matters as well. But then you have to start looking at the university itself. So the university is a particular space. It's different to the schools. It's fundamentally got different ways of behaving than the schools. And the ways that we behave, the ways we think, the way we speak, the way we read, the way we write, are underpinned by values and attitudes about what can count as knowledge and how that knowledge can be known. When we stand up in a class and we start talking to students, you can analyze classroom speak of academic teachers, and you can track it back, and at the root of that is understandings about what knowledge is, not as something given, but rather as something which is made through research. And of course, those values and attitudes may be different to those in schools. Schools don't produce knowledge, schools consume knowledge. In the universities, we've got an understanding of knowledge production, research. And once you go on and do postgraduate qualifications, you start doing that. And you imbibe those values and attitudes. So you can start seeing that coming out in the way we behave, think, speak, read, write. They're different social spaces. So what does all this mean for professionalizing teaching? I've talked about the demands on academic teaching, and they're huge. Huge, huge, huge demands. And I've talked a bit about the nature of so-called underpreparedness and understanding the university as this space, social space, which is different to schools, different to FET colleges as well. And of course, then you'll also get differences between the different kinds of universities, because the UOTs, of course, are very focused on applied knowledge. So what does this mean for professionalizing teaching? Well, one of the things I'd argue is that we need to challenge dominant, taken for granted assumptions about students, about teaching, and about knowledge. We all talk about teaching, and often we talk about teaching on the basis of our experience of being taught. And we talk about teaching in common sense ways. But if you start looking a bit more closely at things like the nature of underpreparedness and the universities themselves, you can see that many of these assumptions are heavily flawed. And you really have to start challenging the way we think. And so that requires two things. It requires a willingness on the part of academic teachers to be challenged, and the ability of the universities, and particularly those in teaching and learning centres, to be able to challenge if we're going to move on, because the university has changed. We have the need for academics themselves to realise the values and attitudes around knowledge and knowledge-making, which are discipline-related. It doesn't matter what you're teaching. It doesn't matter whether you're teaching mechanical engineering or human resource management or whatever. You will have, because of the basis of your own experience in higher education, particularly as you've come through into honours and masters, and if you go on to PhD in particular, you will have imbibed these values. You might not actually consciously recognise them, but they're there in you. And they inform the way you'll behave, what you expect of your students, what you know is right. So if you look at a piece of written work, you'll know it's acceptable or not acceptable within the disciplinary norm. But as I've indicated, academics don't always realise those values and attitudes, and their students certainly don't. They haven't got them. Why should they? Because they're newcomers to the university. And as I've also indicated, they're discipline related. How you produce knowledge in some areas is different to others. What can count as knowledge in commerce is different to what can count as knowledge in the natural sciences. So it's not generic, and that has all sorts of implications for so-called generic courses. But if you think about it, if you think about the need for academics to understand themselves and to understand what we're trying to do in universities in relation to knowledge and knowledge making, this has implications for their own progression up the qualifications ladder and for research. A few years ago, with my colleague Sue McKenna, who many of you might remember because she used to work at what was then Mangasutu Technikon, I did a large piece of commissioned work for the Council on Higher Education, where we were asked to produce a meta-analysis of teaching and learning across the entire system. And the CHE gave us all the data from institutional audits to do that research. When I went in to doing that research, I was firmly convinced that in some universities, the focus had to be on developing teaching. It had to be on developing academic teachers. Forget the research. The crisis is in teaching and learning. As a result of doing that research, I don't believe it's one or the other. I believe that you have to do both. I believe that academic teaching, good academic teaching, has to be so rooted in the discipline, it's not generic. It has to be rooted in the discipline that academics need to understand their disciplines. And the only way they'll get to understand them is by moving up the hierarchy of qualifications, preferably by getting a PhD. So it's not either or. Sadly, it's both, and I confess to really having a radical turnaround as in relation to producing that piece of work for the CHE. We also saw other things happening interestingly in universities where, and we've just got a paper published now. It's coming out. It's called "Trustworthy and Academic and Argumentative Academics." In some universities, the academics were particularly argumentative, and what they were able to do is to resist all sorts of stuff that was being thrust on them by management. In other universities, the academics were much more compliant. And when you looked at the differences between these places that could resist, think, be critical, and in fact be these autonomous universities, the difference was around the qualification of staff. So I think for the health of our system, as well as for teaching itself, it's not either or. every academic has to try and move up the qualifications ladder in the discipline, but at the same time, they also have to become good academic teachers. They have to professionalize their teaching and to stop working in this common sense way. So it's both. I was asked to say, well, if you're going to professionalize teaching, what sort of theories then, and given what I've also said about universities as a social space, what sort of theories do we need to be using in teaching development? So if you're having a workshop or a course or a formal program, what sort of theories should we be drawing on for our academic teachers in academic teaching in 2014? Well, one of the things that we discovered from this big piece of work in the CHE, for the CHE, was in the country, we actually have a very limited use of theory to explain teaching and learning in the South African context. Over and over again, the same theory was being used. It was a very small area of theory. And significantly, those theories didn't completely explain the data. The theory that we had available wasn't adequate to explain the patterns in the student throughput and graduation and success data. And even more worryingly, the theories were often used incorrectly. And I'll give you an example, okay? One of the most frequently used theories came from work on so-called approaches to learning. Now, this work was conducted from the 1970s onwards, and it began in Sweden. It was phenomenological work, later moved into phenomenography, and then researchers in Britain, Noel Entwistle, Paul Ramsden, joined the original researchers, Martin and Salio. And what this original group of researchers identified was students' approaches to learning. And they identified those approaches to be socially derived. So depending on where the students came from, they then approached their learning in different ways. And the two main approaches that were identified were so-called surface approaches versus deep approaches. So they're only an approach to learning. It's sort of like a way you come at your learning. So you are socially disposed because of your previous experiences to learn in a fairly superficial way, or you are disposed, again because of your previous experiences, to seek meaning and to relate those meanings to your own life, i.e. to learn with a so-called deep approach to learning. Now, over time, and this is something that Haggis pointed out, those two terms, a surface approach to learning and a deep approach to learning, have been reconfigured. And now we talk about deep learning and surface learning. And even worse, we talk about deep learners and surface learners. But the researchers never identified deep learning and surface learning. We don't have any research which holds up that concept. And so over time, and this isn't only in South Africa, we've, almost like common sense, we've reconfigured original academic research to come up and claim it's saying something other than it did in fact claim. And why I say that sort of work won't explain the data, you can end up saying, well, you know, you have to be born a surface learner, you have to be born a deep learner, and if the deep learners succeed and the surface learners fail, well then look at our patterns and see who's failing. And are you saying then that this disposition comes at birth, and what does that mean for genetics? It's pretty, dangerous ground that you move into there. Another theory that's often used incorrectly is so-called literacy, academic literacy theory. I wrote a paper at the end of last year where I analysed all the submissions to the Heltasa conference on academic literacy, and very few of them were drawing on correct theory. The theory had been reinvented as something else. So we've got limited theory. The theory doesn't explain the data, often because we're using it incorrectly. So arguably there's a need for the enrichment of what you might call the theoretical stockpot in order to account for our data. We need more theory, and thus we need more and different theory in the professional development courses that we run at the universities. So what sort of theory could we start to use? Well, I'd argue that we need social learning theories. We need to draw on the work of the likes of James Paul Gee, Lev Vygotsky, rather than individualized, psychologized learning theories. If you work with the psychologized stuff, it won't explain the patterns in our data. You've got to understand our data as coming from a particular set of social, economic, cultural, linguistic circumstances. We need hard curriculum theory. And I mean hard, literally there as being difficult, conceptually very difficult. And here I'm referring particularly to theory produced by Bernstein and more lately by Carl Mayton. What that theory will do is will allow us to understand, for example, the difference between a diploma level qualification and a degree level qualification in the same disciplinary area. It's about which knowledge goes into which qualification and how that knowledge needs to cohere in different ways, either to cohere conceptually or it needs to relate more to context. But I speak from personal experience, that theory really, really taxes your brain. At the moment, we tend to use the work of John Biggs on constructive alignment, which says that you have outcomes and you push everything else into line to try to allow students to reach those outcomes. And many of you will be familiar with that. But it's soft theory. It's not allowing us to address the difficult questions that we need to address around things like curriculum. We also need rigorous literacy and language theory. The so-called language problem is a huge problem in our country, but we need to understand that in ways that go beyond the common sense. And we've got that theory. We've got, and there I would particularly look at drawing on systemic functional linguistics, at the ideological model of literacy, and so on and so on. But we're not. Certainly we weren't in the CHE data. Arguably, in order to bring this new theory in, we also need to develop staff in teaching and learning centres. It's incredibly difficult to recruit people to work in teaching and learning centres. Incredibly difficult. And you can track historical reasons for that, the collapse of the academic development movement in the late 1990s. But you know, to work in a teaching and learning centre, you've got to work with difficult academics. And the academics are bright people. They're not like your run-of-the-mill students. You can't boss them about. You've got to win their minds. And it's really hard to do that. So people in teaching and learning centres need to have this heavy theory. They need to be able to relate to academics as well. And they need to be able to work strategically. And if you look across the system, I'm certainly not pointing at any your colleagues at MUT here, for whom I have enormous respect. But you can see that there's a dearth of people who can do this kind of work. And that was recognized by the Department of Higher Education recently, when I put in a proposal for a collaborative grant to develop or to use a version of the postgraduate diploma in higher education specifically aimed at staff in teaching and learning centres. And I didn't think I'd have much chance of getting this grant because the proposal was 5 million. And it would give us 25 people to work in teaching development centres over 2 years, because each one would get a staff development grant, which would allow them to come to Rhodes and whatever. And I'd only got the grant. The DOHET came back and said, can't you upscale it? We need more. So there's an indication there on the part of the DOHET that they're not seeing this capacity in teaching and learning centres across the system. And that's particularly the case outside the main urban areas. Once you get out into the more rurally based universities, it's particularly hard to recruit staff. So given what I've outlined, how do you professionalise teaching in an academic career? What are the things that you need to think about? I've talked about the sort of theories, I've talked about the need to develop people to work in the teaching and learning centres, but what about the academics themselves, given these particular challenges that they face of needing to do research and teaching, needing to get a PhD for themselves, needing to teach huge classes, and needing to deal with so-called underprepared students, i.e. students who are different to them? Well, academics need both research capacity and teaching capacity, as I've said. It's not, I don't think it's one or the other. You can privilege teaching. I mean, you can become teaching focused, but I don't think you can do that at the expense of the discipline. You might become an expert in teaching in mechanical engineering, but in order to become that expert in teaching in mechanical engineering or in physics, for example, has a big tradition of being an expert in physics education, not general education, but physics education. To become that expert, you need disciplinary expertise as well as teaching expertise. So how do you develop both? Well, I think you need to identify a time and place for development through career development planning and mentoring. So if you think of an academic career as spanning, somebody coming in the mid-20s maybe, and hopefully going through till they're 60, when do different bits of development take place at different times? Because there's probably going to have to be times when you focus more on the researcher development and other times when you develop on you focus on the teaching development. How does the university understand when those times might be, and how can the university then start to put mechanisms into place to allow that to happen? And critically, how does the university set up the system of heads of departments and deanships so that the heads of departments and deanships can actually start to guide and mentor more junior members of staff through this development process? You need progression of development activities within that overall career development process. For example, one would expect new staff coming to work at a university to need to go through some sort of orientation to teaching. And that would enable them to get going as a teacher. If you just give them a week-long course or even a semester-long course, that's unlikely to be able to allow them to be able to do really well, to cope well. You're going to have to put other stuff in alongside that. But you've got to think of the new teacher's development. Is that in place? But then what about the more experienced teachers? Well, you arguably need a postgraduate diploma. How does that come in? And how do you organise people to go into a postgraduate diploma? Do you mix everybody up? Do you make it more faculty specific, and so on and so on. The scientists in my university get very angry when they're placed in a PG Dip class with the social scientists. They say they can't understand them talking. So how do you sort that out, okay? And beyond. Some might even want to go on to do an MEd or even a PhD. We do have people at my university who've chosen to do MEd degrees even though they've already got a PhD in their own discipline. So how do you get this range of opportunities, preferably linked to formal qualifications, that will span an academic career? I think teaching and learning staff need to identify that progression. They need to think of how they can put that progression in place, given the resources they have and resources they might be able to draw on elsewhere in the system. Critically, I believe this so strongly, there is a need for professional development activities to be linked to institutional reward and recognition systems and performance management systems. Typically, research is rewarded. If you want to be a professor, you hand in your CV with a long list of publications and you get to be a professor. Is that enough? I don't think so. I've argued that you've got to have both research and teaching. So how do you, for example, link teaching development, courses, workshops, whatever, into an institutional reward and recognition system? You don't often see them linked. What you see is workshops, courses, assessor courses, even formal qualifications offered in the universities, but it's just like they hang there. It's just like they're voluntary. The people who go are those who are converted to the need to develop their own teaching, but they're just sort of floating in the institution. So how can you start to build those into the reward and recognition systems? And I'll give you an example from my own university. Way back in the early 2000s, lots of universities were introducing development activities around assessment. And indeed, in the centre I work in, we set up an assessor development course. There were calls then for that course to be made compulsory for new members of academic staff. So if you were going to take up a job at Rhodes University, you would have to do that course. And in fact, some universities do try to put that sort of thing in place. We didn't make the course compulsory. Rather, what we did was we said, in order to have your appointment confirmed, so I don't know whether you have this, but in my university, if you get a position, you're appointed on probation, and then you have to have the appointment confirmed. We said, in order to get your appointment confirmed, you're going to have to demonstrate that you are a competent assessor. And here's what you have to do. You just have to show us that you can do those things. We want evidence. Show us. The course was available, but it wasn't compulsory. So some people then tried to show us that they were competent assessors, but they failed the test. And what then happened was that they went into voluntarily the course. Some of them didn't even get turned back in the showing process. Some of them just realized that it was much more difficult to demonstrate that they were competent assessors than they thought, and they went voluntarily into the course. So none of our staff development activities have ever been made compulsory. Rather, we've got sets of criteria for confirmation of appointment, and now in the personal promotions process, where staff have to meet criteria in relation to teaching and learning. So if you want to move up to senior lecturer level, you've got to meet these criteria in relation to your teaching. How are you going to meet those criteria? Well, you could do it alone, but otherwise there are courses available to you. So we have a very high uptake on professional development activities because the university is requiring staff members to demonstrate that they are competent teachers. Significantly as well, we don't, in the Teaching and Learning Centre, we don't assess academic staff. I think that's down the road to nowhere. Rather, we got faculty peers to assess each other. So we now have, in any faculty, assessors of teaching and competence who are appointed by the faculty. So it's peers assessing peers in much the same way that research is assessed. So the staff aren't able to say, oh, those people in the Teaching Development Centre, you know, they're... It's rather, it's the faculty who's requiring good teaching from me. It's my faculty colleagues. It's not this external body. So through probation procedures, particularly through personal promotion, you need to do, I would argue that an institution needs to develop criteria, procedures, which start to call on the need to demonstrate competence in teaching. In our personal promotion, you can get to full professor on the basis of being what's called an outstanding teacher. There are a set of criteria for outstanding. But in order to be outstanding at professorial level, you'd need to be able to demonstrate that you were a leader in teaching and learning. You wouldn't get to be professor without also being very good in research. So, but you can privilege teaching even at that level. And the criteria are ranged. So we know that if you're a junior lecturer seeking to move to lecturer level, then you're not going to be able to do as much as a senior lecturer moving to associate professor level. So the criteria change as you move up the academic ladder. So reward and recognition systems. You've mentioned that you're going to have distinguished teaching awards. That's another recognition system. That teaching is recognized as a valid form of academic endeavor, just the way research. Do you have money for people to do research on teaching and learning? That's another thing. Reward and recognition systems. You can also build it in through performance management. Some universities have performance management systems. We don't have a formal one where academics are brought in every year and asked to make plans for what they're going to do the next year or whatever. We've just got this institutional recognition, reward and recognition system. But it's only if you link professional development into that to tie it in to an academic career, I think, that you start to see the application out of the courses. You start to see, for example, people doing and completing the formal assessment, which gets them the 30 credits. The number of people who will do an assessor course and never do the assessment that will get them the certificate is huge. But it's only when they do the assessment, which requires them to think about what they've learned in relation to what they're teaching, that I think you get the real development. You need deans, HODs, as well as teaching and learning staff to be involved in this systematic planning. The professional development of academic staff is, in relation to teaching, is not only the role of teaching and learning centre people. It's an institutional responsibility. It's about looking at a career for academics. So how can the deans and the HODs get involved with that? Can the HODs and deans give advice about when it's appropriate to do what? I would never encourage an academic to do a master's in higher education before, at the expense of doing a PhD in the discipline in my university. That might be different here. But when is it appropriate to do what? I wouldn't encourage a very junior lecturer to do a PG dip as soon as they arrived. I'd say, teach for a year. Go on the new staff orientation, come into the regular meetings, around your teaching, but leave the PGDIP until you've got a year, at least a year's teaching under your belt, because it'll be more meaningful to you then. You need the deans and the HODs to advise on that. And even at the individual lecturer level, the staff member level, does this person need a PhD, or do they need more teaching development? It's got to be a joint conversation in those leadership structures. I'm going to finish with a word on teaching development grants, because we've all been given this money. There is huge money in the South African system intended now to develop teaching and learning. And if you look at those grants, and I served on the reference group which looked at the applications, there was very little evidence of the way teaching development grants were being used strategically to achieve overall goals at institutional levels. So in the teaching development grant application, you had a number of programs. So program 1 was staff development. Program 2, that's formal development of academics as teachers, either workshops, PGDIPs, whatever. Program 2 was about tutors and mentoring, but critically, that was related to producing the next generation of academics. If you're introducing a tutoring system, how can you train those tutors so they then become your next group of academic teachers? Program 3 was enhancing the status of teaching, 4, researching teaching and learning, 5, managing the grant, and the last one was priority programs, student-focused programs. What the reference group looking at those applications found was, first of all, little coherence within the different program areas. So, for example, one university in the area of staff development had 67 different activities, but no thought had ever been given to the way those activities could cohere together. And often those activities were in the same faculty. So where was the role of the dean in looking at how those activities could be coherent to drive the faculty forward in meeting strategic goals? There was also little evidence of the way all 6 programs then came together to drive the teaching and learning strategy of the university. You could get all 6, that was the thinking of the DOHET, to talk to each other. So if you've got university priority programs which, for example, focus on writing, well, how do you pick that up in your staff development? How do you pick that up in the way you're using tutors? Join the dots, make them think together. Similarly, if you looked at the enhancing the status of teaching, most universities were introducing teaching awards, teaching conferences, things like that. But it wasn't always linked to the way funding was provided for researching teaching, or, even more critically, for development of academics in research on teaching. It can be difficult to research your teaching. You can't always apply disciplinary thinking to the researching of teaching because you're not dealing with stuff in a test tube, you're dealing with human beings. So where was that built in? So in our system as a whole, I'd argue that there was more, and the DOHET also argued this, that there was a need to get more coherence. And I'd say that's where deans, HODs need to get involved as well as with people in the Teaching and Learning Centre, in thinking how strategically this money that we now have available can be used to professionalise teaching and learning. So we have a huge task ahead of us. We've come an enormous way in the way we professionalise teaching and learning since the early 2000s, late 1990s, when, or even earlier, I was at UWC in the late 80s, when the argument then was for staff development in teaching. We've come a long way, but we've still got a long way to go. However, I think it's an exciting journey, providing that we can all join in it together and we can all be very thoughtful about it and critical about it. Thank you. We've gone over time. I don't know whether you...
Thanks. That was quite profound and very informative. Can we once again acknowledge the presentation, ladies and gentlemen? I'm going to take 2 questions. I know I have many questions myself, but we have a panel discussion later on, and we can take up the questions that we have with our presenters. She did very well in terms of time, and we managed to recover a little bit from studying late, but I'm going to take 2 questions nevertheless, and then we go for a tea break. And those questions will not come from me. I'll be neutral this time. And I can see, Mr. Nabi, you have a question. Where's the roving mic? Okay, can it go here? And another question from the floor, Mr. Poswa, I see your hand here. Okay, let's take the questions, please. The rest of us colleagues, can we write our questions down, and we will take them later. Mr. Nabi.
Thank you, Doc. Prof, you never fail to engage us, and thank you very much for the presentation. 2 issues. Firstly, you spoke about addressing efficiency, and I think the drivers that you listed were more on a macro level. I'm coming down to the institutional level, and correct me if I'm wrong. There's a terrible big need for transformational leadership to address that issue of efficiency, creative, innovative. We're changing the scenario of how students learn, but we also have to strategize how to change how we lead people into that process. That's the first issue. And the second one, you spoke about the nature of underpreparedness, given that students, many of them come with the lack of wholesome parenting. Most of us are confronted around providing support, and I know you're not a big fan on the so-called individualized psychological learning theories, but do you see a need for being fans of the theory of being invitational?
Okay. Should we take the other one? Both? Okay. Let's take the other one, Mr. Poswa, and then she will respond.
Thank you, Chair. I really appreciate this presentation. My question is on the issue you talked about, the National Development Plan 2030, which touches on the issue of expansion, especially on the upper vertical level. Linking that with your last part of the challenges of the shrinking funds, as well as the need for experience of the staff members before they venture into the vertical level. My question is, how do you see the breaking of the, I would say, the challenge that the UOTs are facing versus the status of the traditional universities, especially when it comes to offering higher degrees, which is often received with the resistance that the UOTs are the right places to do that. How would you advise MUT in addressing that part? Thank you.
Okay.
The question about institutional leadership, I'd see that's fitting into the career progression that I was talking about, and the need to actually plan that. The idea that you might come in as a fairly junior researcher in your junior academic in your mid-20s, but if you're going to stay the course, at some point you're going to be an HOD. And as an HOD, you're going to have to lead with regard to teaching and learning. It's not just an admin post. It's where you will provide leadership around curriculum development, around learning from what's being done already. And you have to be prepared for that leadership. You have to be developed for it. So that would have to build into the progression. The planning of careers, where we deal with the need for people to be both researchers and teaching and learning teachers. The other thing is, to go back to your question about invitational learning, and I absolutely agree with that. It's also about getting all the bits together. You know, our students are social people, and they do have problems. They have emotional problems, whatever. You need to get the bits of all the systems cohering. So you might have a counselling centre. You might have a Dean of Students office, but the Dean of Students office and the counselling centre and the career centre, all those things, they all have to come together in relation to teaching and learning. So it's about joining the dots at a bigger level as well. It's not seeing teaching and learning as just the province of the Teaching and Learning Centre. It's literally about an institutional thing. I mean, how do you know which jobs are available, which jobs you're training for, you know, without the help of the career people? I don't know. Anyway, I'd say it really has to be an institutional thing. Finally, your question about the UOTs. I think the UOTs have a very special role, which the traditional universities cannot play. If you look at the mission and vision statements of the UOTs, they're all around applied knowledge, applied learning, okay? The traditional universities, my university doesn't think about that. I could go and ask the physicists or the anthropologists, what's applied knowledge? And they'd say, what? They're not interested. And in my university, there's been a strong backlash against this, with people saying, we are not preparing for the workforce. We are preparing general academic thinkers. You can see that at UCT as well. The universities are focused on preparing the workforce, and they're focused on applied knowledge and applied learning. You've got a field of expertise there, which the other universities aren't claiming, but which you have to claim. And you need to think about what applied knowledge is, what applied learning is. It's not the same as more general learning. It's very specific. And so there's a real, that there are disciplinary spaces in the UOTs which need critically to be developed, which the traditionals cannot fill. Regardless of what they might say, I don't believe they can fill that. So the universities of technology have to claim that space more forcefully. That would be my position.